alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. Since when did self-defense in the face of terrorist attacks and atrocities become a war crime? The ICC has forgotten too quickly who started this war, who turned a music festival into a graveyard, who attacked, unprovoked, bringing devastating carnage on defenseless victims. The ICC has forgotten the 7 Americans still in Gaza, our fellow countrymen and women. They have forgotten the remains of the innocent Hamas victims that Hamas keeps, the hostages, even in death. They have forgotten the corpses in the streets, the babies and the soldiers beheaded, the people burned alive in their cars. They have forgotten the doors riddled with bullet holes, the ground stained with blood, the smell of decaying flesh. The ICC has forgotten the hell Hamas inflicted on Israel and many other nations, and instead it vilifies a nation seeking justice and the chance to live in peace. This is not surprising. From the beginning, the United States has rejected this body. From President Clinton to President Trump, every president, Democrat and Republican, has never recognized the ICC's jurisdiction over our nation. In fact, no president has even submitted the Rome Statute establishing the ICC to the Senate for advice and consent. We have never ratified it. And why? Because entrusting an international governing body with authority over U.S. citizens risks undermining the very freedoms and sovereignty that define this nation. The ICC has repeatedly sought to impose its authority over the U.S. and over our allies. And now it has alleged that Israel has committed war crimes. Meanwhile, the tribunal conveniently turns a blind eye to atrocities in China, hiding behind the excuse of non-membership, despite the fact that neither the United States nor Israel are members. The hypocrisy of the ICC is breathtaking. Well, enough is enough. Earlier this month, the House passed the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act on a bipartisan basis. And I'm deeply, deeply disappointed that my Democratic colleagues who voted against moving forward on this legislation did that here in the United States Senate. I sincerely hope that they reconsider. Our sovereignty is non-negotiable. Allowing the ICC to operate unchecked and without consequence grants them authority where they should have none. Worse, it sets a standard that encourages repetition. We have a responsibility to protect the sovereignty of our nation and our allies. This moment, it demands courage and it demands conviction, and we must rise to meet it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The other senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act that we voted on earlier in this chamber. The International Criminal Court was created to hold accountable war criminals, for example, in countries that did not have a system of justice, did not have the rule of law, and were incapable of holding those people accountable. In 2020, the International Criminal Court started investigating American soldiers' actions. This despite the fact that we have a system of justice. We are governed by the rule of law. And as my senior senator from Nebraska just pointed out, we're not a signatory to the ICC. We're not a part of that international organization. Last year, the International Criminal Court indicted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel has the rule of law. Israel has a system of justice. And Israel is not a signatory to the ICC. And yet they indicted him. The International Criminal Court is out of control. It's a rogue international organization. And when they indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu, what they did is they put a moral equivalency between Israel's actions to defend itself and the barbaric attacks Hamas perpetrated on October 7th. Let's be clear here. When Hamas launched their terror attack on Israel, they were targeting civilians. That is a war crime. When Israel responds back to defend itself, civilians are going to get hurt in war, but that's not who Israel was targeting. They were targeting the terrorists who attacked them. That's legitimate. The International Criminal Court destroyed whatever shred of credibility they had when they made that indictment. And if they are coming after the Israeli Prime Minister, it won't be long before they start coming after American troops. In fact, the Wall Street Journal had an article that said, if the International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for Israelis, Americans are likely to follow. This organization is a failure. Despite its $187 million budget, it has not been able to bring to justice dictators around the world. They've done very little. Again, my senior senator mentioned China, but they haven't done anything to stop Vladimir Putin. They haven't done anything against Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. They haven't done anything against North Korea's Kim Jong-un. And yet they are targeting countries that have a system of justice and rule of law. That is not why this organization was supposed to have been created. The ICC is a lawless, politicized international organization that is threatening our sovereignty. This requires a strong response on our part. The Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act was that strong response. It would have directed the president within 60 days to launch sanctions against foreign nationals who were involved with the malign activities of the ICC, to target our American troops or our allies, for example. We need to have a strong response back to protect our sovereignty. When we're talking about, for example, sanctions, we're talking about assets, freezing assets of those foreign nationals or travel bans. It would have sent a strong message to all of those foreigners who were trying to target us or our allies. Sadly, the Democrats voted down this important bill that would have sent a strong message. Their arguments were specious, frivolous, meaningless. The Democrats said, well, this bill targets our allies. No, what this bill did was target people who were outside the United States trying to target our soldiers or those of our allies. It was targeting individuals. Democrats said, well, this bill imposes draconian sanctions. Actually, if you look at the sanctions that this bill was proposing, it had been done, the same sorts of sanctions were done under both Obama and Biden 49 times. They said, oh, well, some companies could be held responsible. Again, no, this was about individuals. It was not about companies. And they said, well, the bill was poorly written, poorly drafted. Yet, it had passed, this same bill had passed the House of Representatives twice. The first time with 42 Democrats voting for it, the second time with 45 Democrats voting for it, including two of our colleagues that are in the chamber now that voted for it when they were in the House, except that when they came to the Senate, they voted against it. This was important legislation. Now, when the minority leader got up, he talked about the ICC and being anti-Semitic, and he's right. The UN in general is another one of those international organizations that's anti-Semitic. He says that he stands with Israel against the ICC. But his actions speak louder than words. When he had the opportunity, he stood on this floor earlier and said that Israel should have new elections to replace the prime minister. Well, folks, that action was in the same logic that the ICC is using when they indicted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It seems hypocritical that he could stand up here and say, I stand with Israel, yet they should have new elections, and somehow have the moral authority to defend Israel against the ICC. In blocking this bill, Democrats were voting to not protect our soldiers. They were voting to not stand up for our allies, not stand up for our sovereignty. They were not supporting specifically Israel. The appeasement first policy of the Biden administration is alive and well in the Democrats in the U.S. Senate today. Americans, take note. Mr. President, I yield back.
The senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to add to what my colleagues have been saying here. Big disappointment from us on this side of the aisle that our Democratic colleagues blocked this bill to do what needs to happen with regard to the ICC. Senator Ricketts was just making a really good point with regard to the blatant anti-Semitism at that organization, and it's not new, Mr. President. We all know this is happening, which is why it was a disappointment we couldn't move forward. And it's also something we know has been happening at the UN. Mr. President, I had a Wall Street Journal op-ed a couple months ago when President Biden was getting ready to go to make his last major speech at the UN. And I strongly but respectfully requested the President to make his speech about focusing on the systemic anti-Semitism that has existed at the United Nations for years, and to call out the true terrorists in the world, which is Iran. President Biden didn't make that speech. I had a meeting with the UN Secretary General and now former Senator Ben Cardin, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. It was a bipartisan meeting with the UN Secretary General, and we pressed him. We pressed him hard on his leadership of the UN and the systemic anti-Semitism that exists in these international bodies, these international organizations. The UN is going to have a wake-up call with our new ambassador, Elise Stefanik. I think she's going to really raise these issues, really press these issues. She's going to be a modern-day Jeane Kirkpatrick, who, in my view, is our best UN ambassador ever under President Reagan. She's going to bring it. So the UN, the Secretary General, stand by. You're going to hear a lot more of this from our incoming UN ambassador. She's going to do a great job. Finally, Mr. President, I just want to mention we're focused on the ICC. We're focused on the UN appropriately. This bill should have moved forward. Disappointed. But you know what? We also need to focus at home. And since the October 7th attacks in 2023, the explosion of anti-Semitism that we have seen at our so-called elite universities, I don't call them elite, I just call them expensive universities, on the campuses of the top universities in America has been nothing short of astonishing, disgusting. I don't know what other acronym or adjective I can use, Mr. President, but horrifying. And these are the statistics from the Anti-Defamation League, 2023 to 2024, their annual report on anti-Israel activism on U.S. campuses tallied over 2,000 incidents and anti-Israel incidents of assault, vandalism, harassment, protest actions, divestment resolutions between June of 2023 and May of 2024 increased a staggering 477%. Mr. President, 477% at the top universities in America. This marks the highest number ever documented by the ADL. So I witnessed this at my alma mater, Harvard. My wife and I went there. I don't always talk about it because I'm not proud of it. This university has huge problems. And I was there about a little over a year ago, walking to campus. I went to Widener Library. That's the big, famous library in the middle of Harvard Yard. And went to the reading room during finals of Widener Library, and there was a giant anti-Israel protest in this reading room. Shocking, Mr. President, what was going on at Harvard. And as I wrote then, I couldn't believe this was happening. I took a picture. That's a picture from my camera. This giant anti-Israel protest in the middle of the biggest library, at one of the biggest libraries in America, the reading room at Harvard, pure anti-Semitism protest. And I wrote then in another op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, talking about my experience, my thoughts then turned to Harvard undergrads. Imagine if you were an 18-year-old Jewish or Israeli student, or even a pro-Israel Catholic like me, and you wanted to study for your chemistry final in the Widener Library reading room on a Sunday morning. This was on a Sunday morning. Imagine being confronted by this protest, obviously condoned by Harvard's leadership and commandeered by the Palestinian Solidarity Committee, the anti-Semitic group behind the notorious statement that held Israel entirely responsible for all the unfolding violence in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. Would you feel welcome in Harvard's most famous library? Would you feel rattled and intimidated and harassed by the anti-Israel banner screaming, "Stop the genocide in Gaza"? As Jason Riley has written, if accusing Israel of genocide isn't defamation of the Jewish people, I don't know what is. If you were that 18-year-old student, would you believe the vacuous statements that had been put out a couple days before by the Harvard Corporation after it decided not to fire Claudine Gay, Harvard's president, that, quote, disruptions of the classroom experience will not be tolerated? That was a giant disruption. So, Mr. President, I ended that op-ed by saying this. Not all university leadership is so craven, morally bankrupt, and afraid of the most radical vocal sects of their own student bodies. As a member of the Naval Academy Board, that university couldn't contrast, the contrast with the Naval Academy and Harvard couldn't be starker on issues like civil discourse, so-called safe spaces, trigger warnings, American history, and our unique and, yes, exceptional place in the world. Mr. President, I know we're talking about the ICC, and we should be, but our universities and our great nation need a huge wake-up call, because as we look at anti-Semitism at the ICC and the UN, we need to be staring at it at places like Harvard and other universities where it has reached disturbing and sickening levels. And I think it's this body's responsibility to do something about it. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, this week we observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We honor the 6 million Jews whose lives were lost during the Holocaust, their families, and the scar that that has left on the world. The term "we will never forget" still rings 8 decades later. The end of that atrocity did not bring the end of anti-Semitism, unfortunately. On October the 7th of 2023, Hamas terrorists brutally attacked Israel with the intent to wipe Israel off the map. They killed 1,200 people simply because they're Jewish. People marched through the streets, even in sections of America and on university campuses, screaming from the river to the sea, meaning the obliteration of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation. A few months ago, I stood at the Nova Music Festival site, literally within sight of Gaza. I walked through that area with a family. I talked to one of the survivors that was there that day. She is still reliving the emotion of being there, just doing an all-night music festival. And as the sun came up, terrorists came in to kill as many people as possible at that music festival. In the immediate aftermath of that attack, it was clarifying for the United States we need to continue to stand with Israel. Terrorism is not done. Anti-Semitism has not ended in the world. We should continue to be able to speak out. In my state of Oklahoma, it's extremely personal. We have a lot of Oklahomans that are very pro-Israel because they love freedom. They love a functioning democracy. And as Israel being the only democracy in all the Middle East and a thriving economy, we have a lot of economic connections to Israel. We have a lot of family connections. We have a lot of individuals that travel to Israel for both vacation and for moments to be able to reflect on their own faith. It's a common connection. In fact, after October the 7th, my office and I were personally connected with trying to be able to help some families and individuals who were touring in Israel at that time find a way to be able to escape from the fighting and to be able to get out. It was a very, very difficult moment. And it continues to be a very difficult moment for the people of Israel. It's all they want to do is to live at peace with the people around them. Within days, Israel was not just facing a war with Gaza. Hezbollah began to attack them from the north, from Lebanon. The Houthis began to fire missiles at them from the south. And then within a few months, Iran itself began to fire missiles and rockets and one-way attack drones towards Israel, literally facing a war with individuals attacking them from the north, south, east, and west. Israel just wants to live in peace. In the middle of a war, when a group of terrorists crossed the border and began to slaughter Israelis, the International Criminal Court determined it was going to jump in and make a clear statement. Great. Make a clear statement about terrorism. Call out those that are attacking civilians and slaughtering people as they sleep on that morning. But instead, the International Criminal Court released arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and for Yoav Gallant, the now former defense minister, for trying to defend their country from terrorism. Myself, my other colleagues remembered immediately that during the war in Afghanistan, this same International Criminal Court was filing charges against American soldiers trying to defend the United States while they were fighting in Afghanistan. This is the very definition of a rogue court. By the way, they're in the process of trying to be able to figure out how to be able to fix their image. And so just within the past few days, the International Criminal Court has filed an arrest warrant for some of the Taliban leaders. Well, welcome to the 2000s. The International Criminal Court has now figured out that the Taliban are bad, something the rest of the world has known and recognized for more than 2 decades. This body had the opportunity to do something pretty common sense. Speak out and say, we're not a party to the International Criminal Court. The United States has never participated in that. In fact, no president has ever even requested, Republican or Democrat, to join that agreement for the International Criminal Court. No one wants to be a part of that in the United States. I know of no Oklahoman that would say, we want our troops to be under the authority of an international court. We're not going to do that. Israel, by the way, has also not joined the International Criminal Court. They have no desire to also be under the authority of a foreign court. They've seen full well the UN anti-Semitism, and they have no interest in international bodies trying to be able to tell them right from wrong. So they're not a party to it either. But the International Criminal Court has seen fit to be able to challenge and try to call out American soldiers and to be able to call out the leaders of Israel even after they've been attacked. So this body in the United States Senate had an opportunity yesterday to be able to speak out on that and to actually sanction and to allow further sanctions for individuals from the International Criminal Court and entities that cooperate with them to say you cannot come after the United States or after our allies. It was a very simple, straightforward bill. It was a bill that passed with a very large bipartisan majority through the House of Representatives. In fact, it's passed twice now with a large bipartisan majority in the House of Representatives. But when it came here to the United States Senate, my Democratic colleagues shrugged and said no. The Trump administration, I'm confident, will speak out with sanctions against the International Criminal Court. They did during the first Trump presidency. I'm confident they will again. What I'm not confident of is every future president after President Trump, if they will hold the same high standard to be able to protect American citizens, our soldiers, and to be able to stand alongside with Israel. Now, I've come to this body over and over and over again, and I've said we should speak out in these areas. We should speak out against anti-Semitism. For instance, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that definition of what anti-Semitism is, that's a definition that the United States was a party to more than 3 decades ago. Our State Department still recognizes what it means to be anti-Semitic and makes it very clear on that. But this body has failed to actually impose that same definition of anti-Semitism in our Department of Justice, for instance, with the FBI, or with our Department of Education. And some may say, well, why is that even an issue? Well, ask the Jewish students at Columbia University, and they'll tell you why that's important. This week at Columbia University, masked students burst into a modern history of Israel class, chanting anti-Semitic tropes and calling out to crush Zionism in their class at Columbia University this week, during Holocaust Remembrance Week. I think having a clear definition of what anti-Semitism is and calling out universities that would allow that kind of oppression on their own students, I think is important. I think for this body to be able to speak out with one voice to say, we're not going to allow American soldiers nor our allies to be called in by a kangaroo international court, I think is important to us. And if this week, of all weeks, on Holocaust Remembrance Week, we should speak with one voice. To say never again means never again. And we will continue to stand with our friends and allies in Israel, and we'll continue to stand against anti-Semitism here, there, anywhere. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. Come to the floor today to share a little bit of maybe reflection on the pardons of last week. And a part of the reason why I did it after the president issued the pardons for all of the January 6 protesters, I had a friend of mine call me up because I had said that some of the protesters probably got swept up in the events of the day, but some of those protesters harmed police officers, and I can't support that. I said, when I say I wear this pin almost every day, and when I say I back the blue, period. I back them when they're beaten by people who came into this Capitol on January the 6th. I back the blue because I am endlessly, over the last 10 years, I've been to this floor numerous times to mourn the loss of more than 80 police officers in North Carolina alone who died in the line of duty. I do this time after time after time.